Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. My name is Mark Larimore. I teach at Eugene Lang College.
And I'm Julia Folks. I teach in the adult bachelor's program.
And we're happy that you're interested in the history of the New School. What we're going to do today, since we have about 30 minutes, is take you through some things that we talked about in an open session of our class on the history of the New School. As you know, 2 weeks ago, or hopefully you know, the New School had a big festival called Festival of New, commemorating our centennial, and many classes were opened up to the public. And so they gave classes a chance to provide a sort of an outward-facing version of what they were doing, and we're going to give you a sort of a miniature version of that. That's the syllabus up there. Julia and I have been fascinated by the history of the New School for a part of that history.
About 10 years.
About 10 years, yeah. during which time much has changed. We went through some presidents. You may know we have a new president coming soon. It's an exciting time at the New School. But even as we came in, we felt that this was an institution that was changing sometimes so fast that it wasn't keeping track of all the things that it had been. And so over these 10 years, we've worked together and with other people to put together a lot of really valuable media records and resources that you can follow up if you'd like to. Here's a bunch of them. They're what we're going to be building our talk on today. Want to say something about what?
Sure, the different parts that we'll be referring to. There's a website that we created a few years ago that's constantly being updated, including a lot of things that students have done in our courses and beyond, called newschoolhistories.org. That's what you're seeing in the middle. So I'd really recommend going there. It has readings from people who've been associated, readings and materials of people who've been associated with the school, small biographies and those kinds of things. An exhibition that we'll mention up on the upper right, and now a virtual version of that's on the website. We just did 3 podcasts. I think that you should download them immediately and, just go nuts. And then on the left, we're doing a series of essays in Public Seminar, the online journal of the New School, over the last year and then this continuing year, using the history of the New School and its centennial to think about the issues that are facing higher education more broadly. Shall I keep going? Yes. So we start, though, in 1919. That is the date of one part of our school. As you might have learned, we're a little confusing. We have many parts. If you're here to understand more or to look at Parsons, in fact, is the oldest part of our university. The part that became Parsons School of Design started in 1896. So they have their 125th anniversary coming up relatively soon. But what we celebrated this year as the 100th is the institution we call the New School for Social Research. Now that name's just one branch of our many different sort of parts. But the New School for Social Research began in 1919 as an alternative to higher education. It was people from Columbia and also people part of a new magazine at the time called The New Republic who were interested in trying to figure out and how to make more robust the importance of education in democracy. In this moment after what was then called the Great War and what becomes called World War I, there was this understanding that democracy was in peril and needed to be kind of rebuilt in many ways in the United States and abroad. And to do that, many people believed you needed a far more active citizenry and ones that were educated on the issues of the day. So unlike Columbia University, from which many people came to found the New School, it was not going to be about tradition. It was not going to be about having to learn classical Greek and Latin, as those sorts of educations were about at that time. This was going to be on issues of the day and particularly focused on social sciences that were a new form of understanding at the time and include what we now call anthropology, economics, political science, all of those kinds of things that looked at current day society and tried to apply a scientific method to figure out how to solve the problems facing society. That start, this need for an independent school of social science for men and women, as the proposal from 1918 calls it, this call, was really what we have tried to figure out and has been the thread through this longer institution that we now just call the New School. And history is often channeled around particular individuals. We have some very famous individuals who've been attached to our school, from Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, to Donna Karan, the designer, and Bradley Cooper, the actor. But in fact, what we are sort of interested in doing is trying to figure out the institution itself, and particularly a history of the institution that tries to understand how it has been an alternative and a kind of problem-solving institution in terms of not only the problems facing society more broadly, but also the problems of higher education.
So the history that we tell is a complicated one. As you've started to hear, we have multiple beginnings. The different parts of the New School braid together, but rather late in the history of each of these components. Each of them has its own vision. And if you sort of took a snapshot at different stages in the history of the various component parts of the New School and asked them who they were and what they thought they were doing, you might be surprised at what you hear. So since we were asked to open our class as part of the centennial, we sort of stepped back and thought a little bit about how everybody has suddenly discovered history for about 5 minutes and realized, wow, 100 years, that's a long time. What have we done for these 100 years? And then quickly people moved to the next question, what do we do with the next 100 years? And the entirely useless question, what do you think the New School should be in 2119? Which is a very difficult question to answer. Some people had some interesting responses. All these responses were really telling you something about the current moment, about issues that we haven't addressed or that our institution should find a way of embracing. So at one point we thought it would be kind of fun to look at the history of anniversaries at the New School. So Parsons, as you've heard, was started in 1896. They had a big centennial celebration. In 1996, the New School was barely mentioned. So part of the sort of the late integration of the different parts of the school we see in that. But even more interesting in a way, since we're celebrating the 100 years of the New School for Social Research, is to look at that school when it turned 50, or as somebody called it, the New School at middle age. So this is an illustration from a New School bulletin in 1968, 69, predicting what the future of the New School would look like. And it was also part of a fundraiser, and they said, this is who we are, this is where we're going, this is what it's going to look like. And so these two buildings that you cannot see because they were never built were a center for New York City affairs and a huge center for the performing arts. So the New School already in the 1960s was deeply interested in urban studies. It was one of the premier institutions focusing especially in the research on a particular city, and also very interested in the performing arts. Imagined its future in those terms. This is 1969. Those buildings didn't happen. The reason they didn't happen is because something else did. So as you may or may not know, New School and Parsons merged in 1970. It wasn't part of the long-term plan of either institution. It was in some way an entirely serendipitous and kind of accidental merger that produced things that nobody could have foreseen. We'd like to think that most of the people involved would be pleasantly surprised at what happened, but certainly they would have been surprised. So one of the things that you can check out if you're interested on our New School History vertical, it's now called New School History Seminar, I went back and looked at the Parsons Centennial, which was commemorated in part by having a series of dolls that recreated very important pieces of fashion that happened over the course of Parsons history. As part of the Festival of the New last week, or a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, participants, were any of you there for this festival? Were introduced to these dolls and asked if you were to tell the history of the New School now through dolls, who would you like to see commemorated in a doll? What does it do to be represented in a doll? A different kind of question than was asked in 1996, and I think in some ways closer to what we're about now.
So the other thing, the advantage of looking in the past in these anniversary moments is to realize what we are not. And what we began in 1919 was an institution solely devoted to adults, something that was in fact reiterated in 1969 at our 50th, that we are an institution founded on the education of adults. Originally that meant absolutely no degrees, which were considered to be corrupting of education, and people coming and going, coming for no other reason because other than they wanted to learn something. Now we are predominantly an undergraduate education of people of traditional age of undergraduates, that is relatively young adults. We do still have an adult bachelor's program that I am a part of, that is the first undergraduate program program from the 1940s. But we looked at this question of what does it mean to educate adults and how we not only have lost that, but what might that mean if we took it up again? And in this, both an article that I wrote in our vertical as well as a podcast that we looked at where we talked to some of the people who are older in our institutions and thinking back to what it used to be when they first came here. So the value of anniversaries is not only looking at not what we did not do from 1969, but also what we have lost and maybe why that might be a good thing, why we might need to lose something else perhaps as we kind of think about going forward.
So that's the podcast that you should listen to. In it, you get a chance to hear these amazing voices from some people who were students here in the late 50s and early 60s and came back as part of something called the Institute of Retired Professionals, as well as many other interesting voices, not just our own. So for the next part of this exhibition, next part of this talk, we want to talk a little bit about this exhibition that we helped put together with a curator named Radhika Subramaniam a few years ago called Offense and Dissent, Image, Conflict, and Belonging, whose purpose it was to look at the ways in which the space that the New School creates for learning, creates for public programming, creates for reflection and creative work, and so in what way it succeeds at being an open, welcoming, encouraging, critical space, and ways in which perhaps it is not so successful. And we looked at 3 particular cases and invited faculty, students, and staff to propose contemporary examples as well, all of which we invite you to look up. If you look up Offense and Dissent, you'll find it. It's absolutely fascinating. But we'll talk just about one which is rather well known. I don't know if any of you have seen or have had a chance to see the Orozco murals. They're on the 7th floor of 12 West 16th Street. 66th Street, 12, 66, West 66th, pardon me. And this is a set of murals painted in the traditional mural style as part of the original building. So the New School used to be in some rented places in Chelsea. When it built its own building, this building had to be a statement of what it was that the New School was about. It had to let people know right away that it was a different kind of place, that was about a different kind of interaction, a different kind of engagement with the present, a different kind of way of moving into the future. And as part of it, art was built into the building. So there were 3 sets of murals. One set you can see at the Metropolitan Museum of Art now by Thomas Hart Benton. Another one was in the dance studio and has recently been restored to its original place. And the one that we now treat as this Holy of Holies is this series by Jose Clemente Orozco, very famous Mexican muralist. And the problem with it now is that when we look at it, it's dead. We look at it, it's, it was opened in 1931. It's very old. The things that we see in it are the past. It looks like it's retrospective. It looks like it's telling us how the world is and got to be the way it is, which in some ways is like the old traditional universities that the New School was trying not to be. Instead, what these murals depicted in 1931 was a world in great pain, a world of tremendous oppression, including colonial oppression, as you see in the top right one, the representation of sort of the British Raj in India. And the need for revolution, the imagination that eventually perhaps the world would move out of pain, suffering, oppression, colonialism into something else. And so this space that actually was the student cafeteria in those days surrounded people not with the past, but with a present that was in great pain and a future that was imagined as, in some way, perhaps joyful and peaceful. The bottom one that you see here, called The Homecoming of the Worker, sort of imagines sort of a happy, prosperous world in the future for everyone. There's one other panel that you should go see yourself. That is a prophecy that has just come true. But we want to talk also about how these images that were meant to be inspiring and provocative, future-oriented, speaking to a world that still had a lot of problems that the New School might be in a position to address, turned into something else as time moved on. So, as you might have noticed, right in the middle of the one that we had before, there's a picture of Lenin, the father of the Russian Revolution, and next to him is a representation of Comrade Stalin, Uncle Joe, the United States ally in World War II, and then quickly adversary in the Cold War. And as McCarthyism took root in the early 1950s, a lot of people became very suspicious of the New School, thought that it was a left-wing institution connected to communism, and the proof was that in its cafeteria, it had pictures of Lenin and Stalin. I mean, mean, what better evidence could you get that this was, in fact, a left-wing communist Comintern institution? And so there was a huge controversy that we had a lot of fun looking into. Julia did some amazing archival research. Students, especially alums, were unhappy to be associated with this institution and asked that the murals be destroyed. Other people thought that the murals ought to be kept for their artistic value, which in some way kind of dodges the question about what it is to show politically incendiary images in a public space. In the end, a compromise was arrived at that nobody was happy with. This one particular mural was covered with a yellow curtain. And the rationale given in different ways to different constituencies was, okay, the people who don't need to see it, don't want to see it, don't have to see it, but the people who do want to can always lift the curtain. It's always available for you to see if you want to. We look at it now, and we can't see how it is that these images of Lenin and Stalin might have been provocative, might in some way have been dangerous. But when people look at it now, there are other things that seem inadequate about it. In particular, we find very few women. The representation is almost entirely of men. And its way of sort of imagining a sort of a table of universal brotherhood excludes most of the people that our institution is now deeply committed to reaching out to an inclusion. So I just want to give you two examples of ways in which students over the years responded to this, what had now become kind of a calcified past, and said, in order to bring this to life, we have to make it our own, we have to transform it. One down here is part of an animation in which the table at the center of the murals proliferates, inviting more and more different kinds of people in a kind of chaotic thing with an amazing soundtrack performed by students from the jazz program. And the one on the right is from students from the MFA in Fine Arts, who thought that any kind of a mural that's finished is going to represent the past. Any sort of a list of, or a mural showing these are our heroes, these are the issues of the day, anything that's complete is already going to be closed to anything new. And so they designed a mural that over the space of two weeks changed. From one day to the next, a different image arrived. Each of them was painted in a different style. Some of the outlines were never filled in, and that was their way of trying to capture what it is to live in a future that continues to open up a new way, in which the answers that we think are the right answers to yesterday's questions turn out to form problems for what happens next.
So one of the things that we'll end with here is that certainly one of the questions that Mark and I keep talking about in this 100th year is, as we said earlier, everybody's sort of paying attention to the past now. And we have often sort of looked at the ways in which these sort of mythic moments of our past take over a more nuanced, more complicated understanding of what the institution is about. And so in many ways, you see the institution in its 100th year doing very much of that kind of myth-making, telling us that we're always new, telling us that we've always been coherent and bringing together all these parts. That's not actually the real story about what has happened. We have many different parts that sometimes talks to one another and sometimes don't. And so we're sort of interested in, we've always been interested in getting beyond those sort of, the big narrative of what we sort of tell about ourselves to these sort of smaller, more complicated, and perhaps more contradictory ones that feel a little bit more truthful to us who live on the ground here. And so we decided to do our final podcast on something we kind of looked at as history making, the ways in which, like those students or artists that are remaking the Orozco Room their own, that we are sort of making and remaking the history of the New School all the times in ways that are far more common and informal than the kind of official histories and the kind of marketing supports of our school. So not the authors of books or teachers like ourselves necessarily or archivists, but the people who are sort of bearing witness and who enact the place every day. So we ended up talking to a number of folks, one of whom was a student who gave a lot of tours to the school. And I just want to play you just a moment or two of this episode.
Of story.
It had been 1990.
There you can hear us.
So I think
In between.
That's kind of all.
Because he has a particularly nice way of understanding his own
totally
way of
depends
making
on
his
you.
place here.
His name's Andre Singleton.
When we think about history, think about it in terms of, it just comes out in Portuguese, ancestralidade, the ancestry, but it's more than that. Like when we think about it, not just in terms of what is written, but we really invoke these folks. We try to like invite their spirits back in, because that's what's going to change the things. That's what's changed things for me, because then they could be like, that ain't true. Who wrote that? You know what I mean? And what happens is you get led to that because there are other places.
We're back with
Like, I was
Andre
at
in the
Schaumburg
foyer
South,
of
so
66 West 12th
text that I
Street.
was reading there
It's
and
hard not to
here,
feel like
that
his
moment
campus
was
tour
intersection
is
that I
its
different
own way
stories
of invoking those who came before, of inviting the spirits back in, as he said. Everywhere we go, he has a story from his time at the New School to tell us about a particular mural, a foyer, even a revolving door. So how did you make the New School yours?
I make everything mine. Naturally, I think that what comes from, being poor and black from Kansas City. But those aren't bad things. Those are just things that gave me a certain perspective of things that, like, you don't need money to own anything. Like, I'm spoiled. Like, when people ask me, what do? I literally say I'm a Renaissance man, because I was encouraged to take classes at Parsons, encouraged to take classes at the Jazz School, encouraged to think about solution-oriented ways of being. So it's like, yes, we have this or we don't have this, but it was like, for me, it was a ground that I couldn't have imagined being anywhere else, to be able to at least imagine things happening.
It might.
Okay. So we want to leave you with that thought, and one more before happy to take any sort of questions here right at the end.
Yeah, our sense, as we've been doing this research and sharing it in these various ways, we've had the privilege and the joy of talking to many, many different sort of stakeholder communities, staff, students, faculty, alumni, the Board of Trustees once. This is our first time talking to people who might become parts of our community. We're sharing with you what might seem like the sort of messy story about the fact that everybody who comes to the New School winds up telling their own story about it, because we think that's part of the story of the New School. It's probably true everywhere, but we think it's especially the case here. There's something about this complicated weave of institutions that we are that forces you or invites you to create a university of your own. There's a way in which you will find in it the things that you need it to be. Those might be things that nobody else has found in quite that form before, but you'll be able to do it. There's something about our loose, generous, future-oriented, fly-by-night character that gives you the wings to do that. And at the same time, you'll wind up telling a story about who the New School is. And then you'll become part of the New School in the way in which you sort of change the temper of the place, the connections that people make, but also the historical understanding that it has. So these are just flyers from some of the many different kinds of events that we've had. We're very happy to have shared this one with you.
Any questions for us? Please.
Yes.
So do you think that democracy is in crisis now, and is the New School addressing that? That's one question. And then I was also wondering, because I always thought of the New School as a place of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. Could you define what that means?
Yeah, those are great questions. Let me take I think absolutely on the question around democracy, that it is in crisis, and we are trying to address that. In fact, one of the things on Public Seminar, these different sort of topics, one of which is ours on New School Histories, is another one on democracy and reimagining democracy right now with all of its sort of challenges. So that question is or that topic and that challenge then is, I think, very much related to your second question, which is the interdisciplinary approach. I mean, that has been more fundamental at that school. It's a really common thing to say now in academia, that every place is interdisciplinary. But I like to look at, actually, the Center for New York City Affairs. Jane Jacobs, as you may know, wrote this fantastic book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities that came out in 1963 that sort of changed the way that we look at cities. And she got money from the Rockefeller Foundation to write that book, and she was living over here in the West Village, and she had to go through an academic institution to get that money, the way in which the foundation gave the money, and she chose the New School. And she chose the New School because she said it's the only place that is taking all of the perspectives that we need to understand how cities operate. And that was in 1963. And it seems to me that we have been doing interdisciplinary work, which I think is mainly taking multiple perspectives, having economics and anthropology and humanists look at a problem together, or look at a problem, a common problem from these multiple perspectives. So sometimes people are doing it within their own work, But a lot of times we're bringing together those different peoples to talk about that problem, which I would say is sort of what we're doing with the democracy conversation, for instance, on the public seminar. But New York City, or cities in general, is another topic that I think the university addresses really interestingly because of our design school and our art school. Almost every part of our school is somehow attached and doing something in the city that is sort of building a very deeper, more layered understanding of how cities operate.
Yes. Another great question. As you'll see, one of the discussions that we had, I guess it's, what is it, the very top left is, what does it mean to be a progressive university? So when the New School was started, it was very much part of the progressive era in the United States, and what progressive meant then is very different from what it meant in the 1970s, very different from what it meant in 2000. And we think that just as democracy is maybe in crisis, no, I think that's an appropriately critical way of putting it. I think that understanding what progressive is in a moment of sort of reinvention as well. So part of what makes the institution a response to the crisis in democracy is trying to invite participation from everybody within the institution in a large conversation. Connecting to the earlier question, I think part of what makes the New School distinctive is the legacy of the philosopher of education, John Dewey, who wrote a book called Democracy and Education in 1916, which was one of the founding set of ideas for the people who set up the New School. And the idea that somehow or other education is either democratic or it is not. So if people want to know what democracy is, they will either learn about it in an educational system or an educational institution that is democratically led, democratically run, democratically lived, or they'll learn something else. And part of the New School's commitment to small class pedagogy, to allowing students to freely move across the different colleges and so on, is trying really to sort of live out this Deweyan idea that if you can learn in a democratic way, if you can find that you are learning things from other people, that it's a great thing to be in conversation, in collaboration, working together in a seminar, in a studio, in a production with many other sorts of people, that will make you intuitively democratic, will bring sort of a democratic spirit to whatever you do, and will then truly live out what an education is. The question of what progressive will mean at the New School in 10 or 20 years, I guess I'd punt to the people who are here in 5 years and in 15. Maybe you'll be one of them, but we are constantly debating these very questions. I guess we have time for one more question. Yes, there's one.
Yeah.
Yes.
We do not have an education program. You're absolutely right. And but they've come and gone, which is sort of interesting. We used to have a master's in education that was, teaching teachers for New York City schools just 20 years ago when I first arrived. And there are these occasional places, occasional courses where faculty's own research is about it. I hope that what we do, and I think there is enough evidence to suggest this, is that education is not apart from any other topic. So it isn't pulled out in that way that education schools are, and that they focus on particular kinds of pedagogy and those kinds of things, but we're actually doing that in action, in content itself, whether that be about democracy, whether that be about design, whether that be about how cities function, that we're doing that in action rather than on preparing people to be educators. We're actually doing the work of education in the content areas themselves with these kinds of innovative pedagogical forms and the kind of approaches that we bring more broadly. But if you wanted to get a degree in education, you can't get it here. That is true.
Thank you.
Thank you
I
so
guess,
much.
right?
Good luck
Yes.
today.
Right?
We'll hope that you'll join us.
And if you're trying to find these pages and can't find them, look us up. Our names are in the program. We'll be happy to send you all the links. join our conversation.